What if the oldest library catastrophe records weren't poetry at all, but something closer to forensic documentation? What if the gods described in ancient texts weren't metaphors for natural forces, but names given to beings or weapons that operated beyond Bronze Age comprehension? What if destruction so complete it erased cities from existence wasn't gradual conquest, but something that happened in a single, catastrophic moment? There's a clay tablet in the University of Pennsylvania Museum that scholars still study with a mixture of fascination and unease. Catalog number CBS 2204. It sits in the Babylonian section, one of thousands unearthed from the Temple Library at Nippur in what is now southern Iraq. Its surface covered in wedge-shaped marks that form the opening lines of one of humanity's oldest literary compositions. The text records something extraordinary. It's part of what's called the Lamentation for Ur, a Sumerian composition written around 2000 BCE to mourn the destruction of multiple cities, not gradual decline, not metaphorical loss. The tablet describes catastrophic destruction in vivid, almost clinical detail. Cities consumed by what the scribes called storm and fire, salt deposits rendering farmland sterile for generations, temperatures so intense that they melted mud bricks and turned pottery to glass. And throughout the text, a haunting refrain about divine forces decreeing annihilation through what they termed weapons that came from above. This tablet is one of over 20 fragments that, when pieced together by Samuel Noah Kramer in the 1940s, revealed a literary genre unique to ancient Mesopotamia: city laments, compositions written to mourn urban centers that were utterly annihilated. For decades, scholars treated these as religious allegories, poetic exaggerations, meant to emphasize the gravity of military defeats. But in the desert valleys east of the Dead Sea, something has been unearthed that changes everything. Close your eyes if you'd like. You don't need to follow every word. Some nights you'll drift in and out, and that's perfect. This is for seekers, for those who wonder about the spaces between documented history and uncomfortable possibility. If this resonates with you, fellow wanderer, a gentle like helps others find these stories in the vast digital night. I'm curious, where in the world are you tonight? What hour marks your descent into sleep? Picture yourself standing at the edge of an archaeological excavation northeast of the Dead Sea. The Jordan Valley spreads before you, a landscape of dust and ancient bones. The year is 2013. The temperature hovers at 95 degrees, and the dig site hums with controlled chaos. Archaeologists cluster around a section of earth where something impossible has been found: pottery shards, thousands of them. But these aren't ordinary fragments. Their outer surfaces have melted into glass, bubbled and warped like plastic left too close to flame. Mud bricks that once formed palace walls now exist as twisted lumps of ceramic, their molecular structure altered in ways suggesting exposure to extreme temperatures. Heating experiments would later indicate levels exceeding 2,000 degrees Celsius. Nothing in Bronze Age technology could account for such heat. The excavation is Tol El Hammam, a massive urban settlement that thrived 3,700 years ago as one of the largest cities in the ancient Levant. For 15 years, teams led by Dr. Stephen Collins have been peeling back layers of history here, uncovering a metropolis that covered 36 hectares with walls thick enough to support 4-story buildings and a palace complex that would have rivaled anything in Egypt or Mesopotamia. Then they found the destruction layer, 1.5 meters of charcoal and ash, pulverized brick mixed with melted pottery, roofing clay that had flowed like lava, and human bones so fragmented that forensic analysis revealed extreme disarticulation, bodies torn apart in fractions of a second. The dig supervisor's hands are covered in dust as she photographs a section of wall. The mud brick has vitrified, transformed into a substance that shouldn't exist in this context. She's careful not to touch it directly. Even after millennia, the evidence feels volatile, preserved in its moment of transformation, before and after, frozen in clay. The team works in silence, aware they're documenting something that defies comfortable explanation. Nearby, a specialist in ancient ceramics kneels beside a scatter of pottery fragments. Under magnification, the surfaces reveal microscopic spheres, tiny beads of material that vaporized and then condensed, the kind of evidence usually associated with meteor impacts or industrial accidents, not with a city that predates the Iron Age by centuries. The question forming in everyone's mind goes unspoken. What could have done this? The sun sets over the Jordan Valley, casting long shadows across the excavation. In the fading light, the destruction layer looks like a scar across the earth, a boundary between what was and what came after. Above, the sky deepens to indigo, the same sky that ancient witnesses looked up at when they tried to comprehend what had descended upon them. In Philadelphia, in a climate-controlled archive, CBS 2204 waits in its drawer. The wedge marks pressed into its surface by a scribe 4,000 years ago remain crisp, unchanged. The text describes a wind that came from the heavens, a storm that brought fire without clouds, cities that stood at dawn and were gone by dusk. For generations, this was dismissed as hyperbole, the exaggerated grief of a conquered people. Poetry, not history, but the pottery at Tal el-Hammam tells a different story. The vitrified brick, the pulverized bones, the ash layer that speaks of temperatures no ancient forge could generate. The evidence buried in the Jordan Valley matches the descriptions, preserved in clay tablets, unearthed hundreds of miles away, written by scribes who had no contact with each other, separated by centuries, which implies something scholars are only now beginning to consider, that these weren't allegories at all. The restoration of these fragments, both textual and physical, reveals a pattern that appears across multiple sites, multiple tablets, multiple cities, all describing the same type of destruction, all recording the same impossible heat, all invoking the same divine forces and forbidden weapons. The clay remembers, the dust preserves, and the questions multiply with each excavation, each translation, each anomalous detail that refuses to fit comfortable narratives. In the museum archive, a researcher pulls CBS 2204 from its storage. The weight of it, barely a pound, contains multitudes. She photographs the surface, the wedge marks sharp under the lights. The text begins with a decree from the divine assembly. The Anunnaki have made their decision. The cities must fall. But this wasn't the only city that burned this way, and CBS 2204 isn't the only tablet that records what happened when the wind came down from heaven. In the British Museum on the 3rd floor where the Assyrian collections are housed, there's a tablet that most visitors walk past without a second glance. Catalog number K.3167. It was excavated from the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh in the 1850s, part of a cache of over 30,000 clay documents that constituted one of the ancient world's great archives. K3167 contains another city, Lament. Different city, different scribe, different century. But the description of destruction is nearly identical to what appears on CBS 2204. The same phrases appear, the same sequence of events, the same impossible details about heat and wind and devastation that came from above. When scholars first began cross-referencing these texts in the early 20th century, they assumed it was literary borrowing. Later, scribes copying earlier compositions, preserving a poetic tradition. But the archaeology suggests something else. The cities described in these laments, Ur, Uruk, Nippur, Eridu, Lagash, all show evidence of simultaneous catastrophic destruction around 1650 BCE. Not over decades, not through successive military campaigns. The occupational layers reveal a sharp boundary, thriving urban centers, then sudden abandonment. In some cases, excavations have uncovered destruction debris consistent with the textual descriptions: extreme heat, rapid collapse, mass casualties. The pattern repeats. At Ur, Leonard Woolley's expeditions in the 1920s uncovered a destruction layer that puzzled him for years. The city had been one of Mesopotamia's crown jewels, a center of trade and learning with a ziggurat that dominated the skyline. Then, abruptly, it was abandoned, not sacked and rebuilt as was common in ancient warfare. Abandoned entirely, left to the dust and silence for generations. Woolley documented melted materials. Structural collapse, suggesting extreme force applied from above rather than siege machinery working at ground level. Human remains showing signs of sudden, catastrophic death rather than the protracted suffering of siege warfare. He had no framework for what he was seeing. This was decades before nuclear archaeology, before anyone had studied what extreme heat and pressure do to ancient materials. He catalogued the evidence carefully, noting the anomalies, but offered no firm conclusions. The tablets, meanwhile, were quite specific. Picture yourself in a university library, late evening. The translation spread before you, the Sumerian text of the lamentation for Ur, with its English rendering running parallel. The opening lines describe the divine assembly, the Anunnaki, convening to pass judgment. The decision is made. The cities must be destroyed. Then comes the description of the weapon. The Sumerian word used is UD-DE3, literally storm, but modified with qualifiers that suggest something more specific. The storm that comes from the heavens. The storm that needs no clouds. The storm that brings fire without wood. Another word appears repeatedly, Ashag-4, a field rendered sterile, land that can no longer support life. Not temporarily damaged, but fundamentally altered. The texts specify durations. Some lands would remain barren for generations, which implies understanding of long-term contamination, something beyond ordinary military destruction. The scribes who composed these laments weren't primitive. They were the inheritors of thousands of years of literary tradition, trained in schools where precision mattered. They had words for conquest, for siege, for flood and fire and earthquake. They chose different words for this. In a climate-controlled room in Berlin, researchers at the Pergamon Museum compare fragments from multiple sources. The same phrases appear across tablets, separated by hundreds of miles and several centuries. The brilliance that blinds, the wind that tears flesh from bone, the fire that needs no fuel, the cloud that rises and spreads death. These aren't vague metaphors. They're consistent, technical descriptions. Scholars argue this represents a shared literary tradition, a common vocabulary for describing divine wrath. And perhaps that's true, but it doesn't explain why the physical evidence, the melted pottery, the vitrified brick, the pulverized structures, appears in the exact locations and time periods the tablets describe. It doesn't explain the radiocarbon dating that places these destruction events within a narrow window, around 1650 BCE, matching the historical context of the Laments. It doesn't explain the temperature levels, confirmed through materials analysis, that exceed anything achievable with Bronze Age technology. The mainstream explanation holds that ancient peoples exaggerated military defeats for theological purposes, that the Laments reflect religious interpretation of natural disasters or human conflicts, that the archaeological evidence, while dramatic, can be explained through conventional means: earthquakes, fires, possibly a meteor impact that was then mythologized. But this explanation struggles with the details. Consider, if these texts are merely poetic exaggeration of ordinary warfare, why the specificity? Why describe temperatures that melt pottery? Why mention sterile fields that recover only after generations? Why detail the sequence of destruction? First the blinding light, then the wind, then the fire, then the lingering death. Ancient peoples had extensive experience with warfare. They knew what siege looked like, what conquest entailed. They had vocabulary for it. When they wanted to describe military defeat, they described military defeat. These texts describe something else. In the Jordan Valley, as the sun rises over Tal el-Hammam, the excavation continues. New sections of the destruction layer emerge. More vitrified materials, more evidence of extreme sudden heat. The team discovers something particularly striking: a section of mud brick wall where the heat gradient is clearly visible. One side melted into glass, the opposite side barely scorched. This suggests a directional energy source, not an ambient fire consuming a building gradually, but intense heat applied from a specific direction, overwhelming one surface while leaving the other relatively intact. A fortress fire burns from within, gradually consuming structures. This evidence suggests something descending from above, applying devastating energy in a focused manner before moving on. The dust settles slowly in the morning light. The excavation team photographs, measures, catalogs. Each fragment of evidence is another piece of a pattern that spans cities, spans centuries, spans the gap between myth and material reality. Back in Philadelphia, CBS 2204 sits in its archive drawer, the wedge marks unchanged, patient, waiting for each generation to attempt translation anew. The text describes the Anunnaki's decision, the divine council's verdict, the deployment of what the scribes called weapons that should not be used, which implies knowledge that some weapons were forbidden. That even among the divine forces described in these texts, Certain tools of destruction were recognized as beyond acceptable limits. The tablets record the deployment of these weapons anyway. They record the consequences in meticulous detail, the immediate destruction, the lingering contamination, the generations required for the land to recover. They record the refugees, the abandoned cities, the civilizational collapse that followed. And they record something else, something that makes the pattern even more unsettling. But the tablets record something else, something that points to the sky, to decisions made not in the heat of battle, but in calculated deliberation, as if annihilation itself required divine permission, divine coordination, divine technology that descended from above. In the Yale Babylonian collection, housed in a granite building on the university's campus, there's a tablet that rarely appears in popular discussions of Mesopotamian mythology. Its catalog designation is YBC 2394. The surface is remarkably well preserved, the cuneiform script crisp enough to photograph without enhancement. The tablet doesn't describe destruction. It describes the meeting that preceded it. The text is part of a larger composition, fragments of which exist across multiple collections. When assembled, they reveal something unexpected, a detailed account of the Anunnaki Council convening to debate the fate of the Sumerian cities. Not a generic "the gods were angry" narrative, but specific individuals engaged in discussion, argument, dissent. The god, Enlil, presides. Ninurta advocates for intervention. Nergal raises concerns about long-term consequences. Enki argues against the proposed action, warning that the weapons being considered will render the land uninhabitable for generations. The debate is recorded. The vote is taken. The decision is made. This isn't how mythology typically functions. Myths deal in archetypes, in symbolic truths. They don't usually include committee, meetings, with dissenting votes and recorded objections. Yet here, preserved in clay, is something that reads more like administrative minutes than religious allegory. The text specifies what was decided: deployment of the Yishkijir Melama, which translates roughly as the chariot of terrifying brilliance, and the Tumu Sibir, the weapon of the wind that shatters. These aren't generic divine attributes. They're specific tools, described with technical qualifiers, assigned to particular deities for implementation. Picture yourself in the archive room where this tablet is stored. The climate control hums softly. Through the window, New Haven goes about its evening. Here, in controlled silence, the clay speaks of decisions made 4,000 years ago, or describes events from even earlier, committed to writing around 2000 BCE, but referencing occurrences that predated the composition. The scribal tradition that preserved these texts was extraordinarily conservative. These weren't storytellers improvising around campfires. They were trained professionals, educated in temple schools where accuracy was paramount. Scribal errors were serious offenses. The preservation of precise wording across generations was a sacred duty, which implies that when these scribes recorded the Anunnaki Council's deliberations, they believed they were preserving accurate information. Whether that information originated as eyewitness accounts, official records, or inherited tradition is unclear, but the treatment suggests documentary intent, not creative fiction. The tablet continues with post-decision details. Once the vote is taken, specific assignments are made. Ninurta will oversee deployment in the northern cities. Nergal takes responsibility for the southern targets. The timing is coordinated. The strikes must be simultaneous to prevent evacuation, to ensure complete destruction. There's a chilling, bureaucratic precision to it. In Nippur, where many of these tablets were originally housed in the temple library, the scribes maintained extensive archives. Archaeological excavations in the late 19th and early 20th centuries revealed thousands of documents, administrative records, literary compositions, religious texts, educational materials. The library represented centuries of accumulated knowledge, carefully organized and preserved. Among these documents, the city laments occupied a special category. They were copied and recopied, included in scribal curriculum, maintained with unusual care. Students learning to write would practice by copying sections of these texts, which means that for centuries after the events described, Mesopotamian civilization deemed it essential that these specific compositions be preserved, memorized, transmitted. Why? If they're merely poetic responses to military defeats, why this level of preservation? Ancient Mesopotamia experienced countless military conflicts, rises and falls of dynasties, destructions, and reconstructions. Most received minimal literary attention, a few lines in king lists, brief mentions in administrative records. The city laments are different. They're extensive, detailed, preserved across multiple copies in multiple locations. The care taken with these texts suggests they served a function beyond mourning, perhaps warning, perhaps evidence preservation, perhaps both. The theological framework presents another puzzle. The Anunnaki, in Sumerian tradition, aren't distant, unknowable deities. They're described as physical beings with defined roles, territorial assignments, familial relationships. They eat, they argue, they make decisions that have consequences. The texts describe them arriving from elsewhere, establishing presence in Mesopotamia, interacting with humans in ways that blur the boundary between mythology and history. In the British Museum's collection, there's a cylinder seal from the Ur-III period, showing Anunnaki figures in what appears to be a council setting. The imagery is formal, structured, not worshipful scenes, but something closer to administrative hierarchy. The beings depicted wear distinctive headgear, carry specific implements, are arranged according to apparent rank. These aren't abstract cosmic forces. They're portrayed as organized, technological, operating within defined systems of authority and procedure. The weapon descriptions in the Lament texts carry the same specificity. When the tablets describe the melamma, they use language that suggests visible phenomena, brilliance that blinds, light that precedes impact, radiance that causes physical harm. Modern translators have struggled with some of these terms because ancient Sumerian had no frame of reference for concepts like radiation or plasma effects. But the descriptions are consistent. The brilliance comes first, then the wind. Not meteorological wind, but force, concussive pressure that tears structures apart and strips flesh from bone. Then the fire, which burns without needing combustible materials. Then the aftermath, the sterile fields, the contaminated water, the lingering death. Scholars argue these represent poetic elaboration of natural disasters, earthquake, perhaps, followed by fires, or a severe storm. The divine framework simply reflects how ancient peoples interpreted natural catastrophes, attributing to gods what we now understand through geology and meteorology. But earthquakes don't melt pottery into glass. Storms don't create temperature levels exceeding 2,000 degrees Celsius. Natural fires don't render soil sterile for generations. The texts describe something for which ancient scribes had no vocabulary except the theological. They reached for the language of divine intervention because they had no other framework to explain what witnesses reported, what the ruins revealed, what the refugees who survived carried in their memories. In the Yale archive, YBC 2394 rests in its storage. The wedge marks detail Enki's final objection before the vote. He warns that use of these weapons will break something fundamental, that the consequences will echo across generations, that once deployed, certain knowledge cannot be forgotten, certain boundaries cannot be restored. His objection is noted, overruled. The decision stands. The tablets describe the aftermath in ways that modern science can now verify. Temperature signatures, destruction patterns, contamination timelines. The ancient scribes recorded what they could observe, framed in the only language available to them. The question isn't whether they understood the physics. The question is whether they accurately recorded what happened. On July 16, 1945, at 5:29 in the morning, the first atomic bomb detonated at Trinity Site in the New Mexico desert. The explosion vaporized the steel tower supporting the device and transformed the sand beneath into a glassy substance that would later be called trinitite, silicon dioxide fused by temperatures exceeding 1,400 degrees Celsius into a jade green glass. 76 years later, researchers examining materials from Tal el-Hammam would find something eerily similar. The comparison isn't casual. It's documented in peer-reviewed literature, published in Nature Scientific Reports in 2021. The study, led by a multidisciplinary team including archaeologists, geologists, and materials scientists, examined the destruction layer at the Jordan Valley site with modern analytical techniques. What they found defies conventional archaeological explanation. The pottery fragments show clear evidence of vitrification, transformation into glass-like material requiring sustained temperatures above 1,500 degrees Celsius. Mud brick samples reveal similar alterations, with clay minerals transformed into structures that don't occur naturally or through ordinary fire. The heating was intense enough to melt zircon crystals, which requires temperatures approaching 1,700 degrees Celsius. But it's the shocked quartz that makes the evidence particularly striking. Shocked quartz forms when crystalline silicon dioxide is subjected to extreme pressure and temperature simultaneously, conditions typically associated with meteor impacts or nuclear detonations. The crystals develop distinctive planar deformation features, microscopic fractures visible only under high magnification. These patterns don't occur in ordinary geological processes or conventional fires. The Tal el-Hammam destruction layer contains shocked quartz. Picture yourself in a laboratory in Albuquerque, late afternoon light filtering through the windows. A materials scientist adjusts the microscope, bringing a sample from the excavation into focus. The planar features are unmistakable. parallel fracture lines cutting through the crystal structure at precise angles. She's seen this before, in samples from meteor impact sites, in materials recovered from nuclear test ranges, not in Bronze Age archaeological contexts. The analysis continues. Scanning electron microscopy reveals the presence of microspheres, tiny beads of minerals that vaporized and then condensed in midair. The size distribution and composition suggest temperatures high enough to liquefy silicates. The spheres are found throughout the destruction layer, embedded in the matrix of ash and pulverized material. Carbon-14 dating of organic materials from the destruction layer provides a time frame, approximately 1650 BCE, with a margin of error of about 50 years. This matches the historical period when the Sumerian city laments were composed, when the archaeological record shows simultaneous abandonment of multiple urban centers across Mesopotamia. The evidence is building toward something uncomfortable. In a Berlin laboratory, another team examines samples from Ur's destruction layer, excavated during Woolley's expeditions and preserved in museum archives. The materials show similar characteristics: extreme heating, mineral transformation, evidence of forces beyond conventional warfare or accidental fire. The temperatures required to produce these effects can be calculated. Ordinary structure fires reach perhaps 800 degrees Celsius. Bronze Age furnaces used for metalworking could achieve around 1,100 degrees Celsius in controlled conditions. The destruction layers at Tal el-Hammam, Ur, and other sites show evidence of heating that exceeded 2,000 degrees Celsius over wide areas, simultaneously. The mainstream counter-explanation focuses on meteor impact. The Tunguska event of 1908 provides a useful comparison. A meteor that exploded in the atmosphere over Siberia, releasing energy equivalent to several megatons of TNT. The airburst flattened trees over 2,000 square kilometers, generated temperatures high enough to ignite the forest, and created a pressure wave that registered on seismographs across Europe. Crucially, Tunguska left no crater. The object exploded at altitude, releasing its energy as an airburst rather than a direct impact. A similar event over the Jordan Valley around 1650 BCE could, theoretically, explain the physical evidence: the extreme temperatures, the directional heating patterns, the shocked quartz and vitrified materials, the simultaneous destruction across a wide area. But this explanation, while scientifically plausible, raises its own questions. Why did the Sumerian scribes attribute the destruction to divine weapons rather than a sky stone or falling star, phenomena they had vocabulary to describe? Ancient Mesopotamian texts include numerous references to meteors and celestial events. When they wanted to describe objects falling from the sky, they did so explicitly. The Lament texts use different language. They describe deliberate deployment, coordinated strikes, divine decision-making. These aren't the terms used for natural disasters. In a university archive in Philadelphia, a researcher examines high-resolution images of CBS 2204. Modern imaging techniques reveal details invisible to earlier scholars. The cuneiform includes technical notations in the margins, scribal marks indicating emphasis, preservation priority, educational importance. One notation, recently translated, reads, to be remembered. What was permitted should not have been, which implies awareness that what occurred was a choice, not a natural catastrophe, that the weapons from heaven represented a decision made by conscious agents, not the random violence of an uncaring universe. The physical evidence at Tal el-Hammam includes one more detail that troubles researchers. The destruction wasn't uniform. Certain structures show extreme damage while adjacent buildings suffered relatively minor harm. This pattern suggests directed energy rather than the more uniform destruction expected from an airburst. One section of the palace complex shows a heat gradient, intense vitrification on surfaces facing a particular direction, minimal damage on opposite walls, as if something descended from a specific angle, applied devastating energy, and moved on. The dust of the Jordan Valley holds this evidence still. Each grain of sand, each fragment of pottery, each crystalline structure bears witness to temperatures and pressures that Bronze Age humanity had no ability to generate. The evidence is preserved with remarkable clarity, waiting 4 millennia for technology sophisticated enough to read it properly. Materials analysis can tell us what happened: extreme heat, extreme pressure, rapid destruction. Radiocarbon dating can tell us when, approximately 1650 BCE. Archaeological context can tell us where, multiple cities across Mesopotamia and the Levant. What the physical evidence cannot tell us is why. For that, we must return to the tablets, to the descriptions of divine councils and forbidden weapons, to texts that describe precisely what the archaeological record now confirms: destruction that came from above, that exceeded any known natural or human capability, that rendered flourishing cities into ash and glass in moments. The Sumerian scribes recorded temperatures that melt stone. Modern science confirms those temperatures existed. The scribes recorded effects that sterilize soil. Soil analysis confirms long-term contamination. The scribes recorded destruction that came from the heavens. The physical evidence shows directional heating consistent with aerial phenomena. Unless the tablets are describing exactly what they saw, from their perspective, using the only framework available to them, witnessing something that 4,000 years later would require nuclear physics and materials science to fully understand, but which in 1650 BCE could only be comprehended as divine intervention, as weapons wielded by the Anunnaki, as decisions made in councils beyond human authority. In the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, there's a fragment of glazed brick that once formed part of the Ishtar Gate of Babylon. The surface is brilliant, blue, decorated with reliefs of mythological creatures, dragons and bulls rendered in precise, repeated patterns. Among the less examined sections are smaller panels, depicting figures identified in cuneiform inscriptions as Anunnaki. They're not portrayed as abstract deities. They wear distinctive garments, carry specific implements, stand in hierarchical arrangements that suggest organizational structure rather than spiritual symbolism. The Anunnaki, in Mesopotamian tradition, occupy a curious space. They're described as divine, yet their divinity operates differently from the transcendent gods of later monotheistic traditions. They have needs. They make mistakes. They engage in politics, family disputes, territorial negotiations. They arrive from elsewhere and establish presence in specific locations. The earliest Sumerian texts don't present them as creators of the universe, but as administrators of it. or at least administrators of the Mesopotamian region. They assign roles, delegate responsibilities, make decisions that affect human affairs. The relationship described isn't worship of unknowable cosmic forces, but something closer to governance by a technologically superior authority, which raises uncomfortable questions about how to interpret their actions. Picture yourself in a quiet corner of the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago. The research library holds one of the world's finest collections of Mesopotamian literature. On the table before you lies a translation of the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic. The text describes the Anunnaki's origins, their arrival, their establishment of order from chaos. But chaos in this context doesn't mean void. It means pre-existing conditions that required management, organization, technological intervention. The Anunnaki are credited with establishing agriculture, urban planning, metallurgy, writing, the foundations of civilization. Not through miraculous creation, but through teaching, demonstration, structured implementation. The texts describe them as those who from heaven to earth came. The Sumerian phrase Anunnaki breaks down literally to offspring of the sky-earth union, or those who came from the heavens to earth. Not metaphorical language, but directional description. They're assigned specific cities, specific functions. Enlil governs from Nippur. Enki oversees Eridu. Inanna holds authority in Uruk. These aren't abstract domains, but actual urban centers where temple complexes served as administrative headquarters. Archaeological excavations at these sites reveal sophisticated organizational systems, record-keeping, resource distribution, technological development. The Anunnaki appear in these contexts not as distant supernatural forces, but as present administrators with defined jurisdictions. In the Louvre, in a gallery devoted to Mesopotamian antiquities, a stele depicts what scholars call a divine council scene. The figures are arranged in deliberate hierarchy, some seated, some standing, all engaged in what appears to be discussion or debate. The imagery echoes the council descriptions in the Lament texts, the meetings where decisions were made, votes were taken, dissent was recorded. The weapon descriptions in the Laments take on different resonance when viewed through this administrative framework. The texts don't describe miracles. They describe deployment of specific tools by authorized personnel following a formal decision process. The Gishgigir Melam Ma, the chariot of terrifying brilliance, is assigned to Ninurta. Not conjured spontaneously in anger, but deployed deliberately, like equipment assigned to a military commander. The descriptions focus on observable effects: the blinding light, the heat, the pressure wave, the aftermath. Throughout Mesopotamian literature, the Anunnaki possess technology. They travel in vehicles described as boats of heaven that fly through the air. They use devices that allow communication across distances. They employ weapons that produce effects beyond human capability. These aren't presented as magical violations of natural law, but as advanced applications of principles the Sumerians didn't fully understand. The distinction matters. Magic in ancient literature is typically described as mysterious, unpredictable, requiring incantations and ritual. The Anunnaki's tools are described as reliable, consistent, operating according to fixed principles. The difference between a miracle and technology is often just the observer's level of understanding. In the Berlin archives, researchers have cataloged references to Anunnaki technology across hundreds of tablets. The descriptions maintain consistent details: vehicles that rise without wings, weapons that strike without projectiles, devices that create light without fire. The repetition suggests not imagination, but observation, not poetry, but attempted documentation. Scholars argue this represents primitive attempts to explain natural phenomena through supernatural frameworks, that ancient peoples, lacking scientific understanding, attributed incomprehensible events to divine agency. Thunder becomes Thor's hammer. Earthquakes become Poseidon's wrath. Meteor impacts become weapons of the gods. This interpretation is reasonable, even likely for many mythological traditions, but it struggles with the Mesopotamian evidence's specificity and consistency. Consider the weapon effects described in the Laments. If these were simply metaphorical expressions of divine anger, we might expect variety, creativity, escalating exaggeration across different compositions. Instead, we find technical consistency. The same sequence of effects, brilliance, wind, fire, contamination, appears across multiple texts by different scribes in different time periods. The physical evidence matches these descriptions with uncomfortable precision. The archaeological record shows exactly what the tablets describe: extreme heat, directional energy, contamination requiring generations to dissipate. Either the scribes exaggerated, and by extraordinary coincidence, the archaeological evidence happens to match their poetic elaborations, or they recorded what witnesses reported as accurately as they could within their conceptual framework. The Anunnaki mythology includes another troubling element: regret. Multiple texts describe the divine council's remorse after the destruction. Enlil laments the decision. Inanna mourns the lost cities. Even Nergal, who advocated for the strikes, questions whether the action was justified. This isn't how mythology typically functions. Gods don't usually express regret for their actions. Divine will is presented as righteous by definition. But the Mesopotamian texts preserve these expressions of doubt, these acknowledgments that perhaps the weapons shouldn't have been used, that the consequences exceeded what was necessary or acceptable. The preservation of this regret is telling. It suggests the decision was controversial even among those who made it, that the use of these weapons violated some boundary, some principle that even the Anunnaki recognized as significant. In the Yale collection, a fragment describes Enki's final argument before the vote. He warns that deployment of these weapons will establish a precedent, that once demonstrated, the knowledge cannot be contained, that humanity will eventually develop similar capabilities and face similar choices. His warning, preserved in clay, echoes across 4 millennia. The Anunnaki context doesn't resolve the mystery. It deepens it. Were these beings who possessed advanced technology that ancient humans interpreted through theological frameworks? Were they myth-makers' attempts to explain natural catastrophes? Were they something else entirely, symbolic representations of forces the Sumerians understood metaphorically rather than literally? The tablets offer one more clue, one fragment that stands apart from all the others, that breaks the pattern and forces reconsideration of everything that came before. But there's one tablet that breaks the pattern entirely. One document preserved in Paris. that describes the destruction in terms that make even skeptical scholars pause, that uses language suggesting the scribes understood more than we've given them credit for. In the Louvre Museum, on the second floor, where Mesopotamian antiquities occupy a series of interconnected galleries, there's a tablet that scholars debated for decades before reaching consensus on its translation. Catalog number A 06020. It was excavated in southern Iraq in the early 20th century, part of a cache discovered in what had been a private archive rather than a temple library. The tablet contains a lament fragment, but this one is different. Most city laments follow a established pattern: invocation of the gods, description of the divine decision, account of the destruction, mourning for the lost city, eventual acceptance of divine will. They're formulaic in structure, which is part of what made scholars view them as literary compositions rather than historical documents. A06020 breaks the formula. The text begins conventionally enough, describing the divine council's decision and the deployment of the weapons. Then it shifts into something unexpected, a detailed account of the destruction's progression over time, not metaphorical time. The text uses specific temporal markers. On the first day, by the third day, in the weeks that followed. This isn't poetic pacing. It's chronological documentation. The fragment describes what happened before the weapon in clinical detail. The city at dawn. The market opening. People in the streets. Normal activity. Then it describes the moment of impact with precision that makes translators uncomfortable. The brilliance came first, brighter than 1,000 suns rising at once. Those who looked upon it were blinded. Those who stood in its presence felt their skin burn before the wind arrived. Picture yourself in a climate-controlled archive room in Paris. Evening settles over the city. The tablet rests on a support cradle, positioned for photography. The cuneiform is crisp, well-preserved. The scribe who pressed these marks into clay 4,000 years ago took care with this composition. The wedges are uniform, the spacing consistent. This was meant to be preserved. The text continues with the sequence, the blinding light. Then silence, a pause described as the breath between heartbeats. Then the wind, arriving not as gradual increase, but as sudden, devastating force. The wind that tears the flesh from the bones, that throws stones through the air like dust, that flattens buildings as reeds are flattened by floodwater. The description of heat comes next. Not fire spreading through structures, but heat that arrives instantaneously, melting pottery where it sits, causing clay bricks to flow like water, turning sand to glass, heat that needs no wood, no oil, no fuel, heat that descends from above and consumes without burning. Then the aftermath. This is where A06020 becomes truly anomalous. The text describes survivors, those who fled before the impact, those who were far enough from the center to escape immediate death. It describes what happened to them in the days and weeks that followed. Those who fled the wind sickened. Their hair fell from their heads. Blood ran from their mouths and noses. They vomited and could not stop. Their skin developed sores that would not heal. Many died in the days after the wind, though they had not been touched by it directly. The Sumerian word used is namtag, which translators have struggled to render precisely. The root suggests curse or poison, but with a qualifier that indicates contamination, something that spreads through contact, that lingers in the environment. The text describes people who touched objects from the destroyed city and subsequently sickened. It describes water that could not be drunk, soil that could not be farmed, air that caused illness to those who breathed it. This is radiation sickness described by people who had no concept of radiation. The text specifies durations. The land would remain contaminated for 7 times 7 years, 49 years, roughly 2 generations. After this period, the contamination would fade enough for cautious resettlement. The timeline matches, with unsettling precision, the half-life decay of certain radioactive isotopes. Scholars argue this represents metaphorical description of plague or disease that followed the destruction. That ancient peoples, seeing survivors sicken and die, attributed it to divine curse rather than understanding biological or environmental causes. But plague doesn't cause hair loss, bleeding from mucous membranes and skin lesions in the specific pattern described. Plague doesn't render soil infertile for precisely calculated durations. Plague doesn't create contamination that fades over generational timescales. The description in A0602, 0 matches radiation syndrome with disturbing accuracy. In a laboratory in Lyon, France. Linguistic team has been analyzing the tablet using advanced imaging techniques. Multispectral photography reveals additional text in margins previously thought blank. Scribal annotations added later, perhaps by archivists attempting to preserve context. One annotation reads, "This account comes from those who survived, to be preserved as warning. What was done cannot be undone. What was learned cannot be unlearned," which implies the scribe recognized this text as something beyond ordinary lament composition, that it represented testimony, evidence, warning for future generations about capabilities that existed and consequences that followed their use. The fragment includes one more detail that troubles researchers. It describes a cloud that rose from the place of impact, climbing into the sky, spreading outward in the shape of a tree or mushroom. This image appears nowhere else in Mesopotamian literature. It's specific, visual, detailed. It's the shape of a nuclear explosion's mushroom cloud, described 4,000 years before the Trinity test. The mainstream interpretation holds that this represents poetic elaboration, that the scribe was creating vivid imagery to emphasize the catastrophe's magnitude. That the similarities to modern weapon effects are coincidental, that humans across time periods describe devastating events using similar metaphors. But A0620 doesn't read like metaphor. It reads like a report. The temporal precision, first day, third day, weeks later. The sequence of effects, light, silence, wind, heat, contamination. The long-term consequences, specific durations, generational timelines, environmental recovery periods. The survivor testimony, symptoms that match radiation exposure, contamination that spreads through contact, sickness that develops in those who escaped the initial blast. Every detail suggests documentation of observed phenomena, not creative composition. In the Louvre archive, A06020 waits in its controlled environment. The clay is stable, the text intact. Whatever the scribe intended 4 millennia ago, warning, evidence, memorial, the words remain. before the weapon and after the weapon. Two states of existence, a boundary crossed. The question the tablet forces is simple but profound. Did ancient peoples witness something they couldn't explain and describe it using available frameworks? Or are we projecting modern understanding onto ancient poetry? The answer might lie in what happened after the destruction, in the archaeological record of how civilizations responded to the catastrophe, in the patterns of abandonment and resettlement that followed the wind from heaven. The answer might lie in examining not just what was destroyed, but what survived, and why those who lived through the aftermath worked so desperately to ensure the memory would never fade. In the British Museum's collection of Mesopotamian chronologies, there's a series of tablets that document something remarkable: the sudden, simultaneous collapse of urban civilization across southern Mesopotamia around 1650 BCE. Not gradual decline, not sequential conquests spreading over decades, synchronous abandonment of major population centers within a narrow time frame. The king lists show it clearly. Ur, which had been the seat of a powerful dynasty, simply ceases to have rulers. The administrative records stop. The archaeological layers show thriving city, then destruction layer, then abandonment for generations. The same pattern appears at Uruk, at Lagash, at Eridu, cities that had stood for millennia, that had survived floods and invasions and political upheavals, suddenly emptied. The silence lasted for decades. Picture yourself examining a map of ancient Mesopotamia. The cities marked according to their occupational chronology. For the period before 1650 BCE, the region glows with dense settlement, urban centers connected by trade routes, agricultural zones supporting substantial populations, temple complexes serving as administrative hubs. After 1650 BCE, vast areas go dark. The cities are abandoned. The trade routes dissolve. The agricultural zones lie fallow. Migration patterns recorded in later texts describe populations fleeing northward, into regions that had been peripheral, but were far enough from the destruction zones to remain habitable. The refugees carried their memories with them. In the archives at the University of Pennsylvania, there's a tablet from the subsequent period, after the abandonment, during the early phases of attempted resettlement. It's an administrative document, recording resource allocation for a group attempting to reoccupy the ruins of Ur. The text is matter-of-fact about the challenges. The land does not yield. The water causes sickness. Those who remain too long in the old places fall ill. This isn't metaphorical language. It's practical reporting by administrators trying to rebuild civilization in the wake of catastrophe. The land was contaminated. Generations would need to pass before safe resettlement could occur. The Lament compositions took on new significance in this context. They weren't just mourning texts. They were educational curriculum, required reading in the scribal schools that slowly reestablished themselves in safer locations. Students learning to write would copy these texts repeatedly, memorizing not just the words but the warnings they contained. In the Louvre, a student tablet from around 1800 BCE, 2 centuries after the destruction, shows practice copies of lines from the Lamentation for Ur. The student's handwriting is unsteady, wedges imprecise, but the content is carefully preserved. Remember the wind that came from heaven. Remember the cities that stood at dawn and were gone by dusk. remember that some weapons should not be used. The emphasis on remembering is consistent across the preserved laments, not just grief, but preservation of specific knowledge, warning future generations, creating permanent record of what happened when certain boundaries were crossed. Why would a civilization invest such effort in memorializing its own destruction? The answer emerges from examining the broader pattern of recovery. The resettlement of southern Mesopotamia didn't happen through gradual drift of populations back to familiar territories. It happened through careful, deliberate assessment of which areas had recovered enough to support life. The texts describe testing soil, testing water, observing whether plants would grow and animals could graze without sickening. This suggests understanding, however limited, that the contamination wasn't permanent, but would fade with time, that patience and caution could eventually allow return to the devastated lands. In Berlin, archaeologists have mapped the resettlement patterns. The timeline matches what the tablets predict. Approximately 50 years after the destruction, close to the 7 times 7 years mentioned in AO 6020. Cautious reoccupation begins. Small settlements appear in the ruins. Agricultural activity resumes. The region slowly rebuilds, but it never fully recovered. The great urban centers of the early Bronze Age, the cities that had defined Mesopotamian civilization for 2,000 years, remained diminished. Ur never regained its former prominence. Uruk, once the largest city in the world, became a shadow of what it had been. The center of power shifted permanently northward, to Babylon and eventually to Assyria, regions that hadn't experienced the direct effects of the catastrophe. The cultural memory remained vivid. Centuries after the event, scribes still copied the laments with meticulous care. The Anunnaki mythology, with its emphasis on divine councils making decisions about weapon deployment, became central to Mesopotamian religious thought. The idea that some knowledge was forbidden, some capabilities too dangerous to use, wove through subsequent literature. In the Yale collection, a wisdom text from the first millennium BCE, over 1,000 years after the destruction, includes this warning: "Seek not the weapons of the ancient gods. That knowledge brings only ash and silence. Better to live in mud and ignorance than to command forces that destroy the very ground beneath our feet." The echo is clear. The civilizational trauma had become proverbial, educational, cautionary. Modern parallels are unavoidable. Hiroshima and Nagasaki invested enormous effort in preserving memory of the atomic bombings. Museums, memorials, survivor testimonies, educational programs. The imperative isn't just to remember suffering, but to ensure future generations understand what nuclear weapons do, the consequences of their use, the importance of preventing their deployment. The Sumerian laments served similar functions. They preserved technical details, not just emotional impact, but specific effects, sequences, timelines. They emphasized that these weapons existed, that their use had catastrophic consequences, that the decision to deploy them was controversial even among those with authority to make such choices. The tablets record the Anunnaki's regret. Multiple compositions include laments by the gods themselves, expressing sorrow over the destruction they authorized. Enlil mourns the lost cities. Inanna weeps for her people. Even Nergal, who advocated for the strikes, questions whether the action was justified given the scale of devastation. This divine regret is narratively unusual. Gods typically act with impunity, their decisions unquestioned, their will supreme. But the Mesopotamian texts preserve doubt, remorse, acknowledgement that a mistake was made, which implies moral framework, recognition that some actions, even when technically possible, even when authorized by highest authority, cross lines that shouldn't be crossed. The preservation of this moral dimension suggests the scribes understood they were recording, not just catastrophe, but cautionary tale. In the silent galleries where these tablets rest, the message persists. Cities can fall in a day. Land can be rendered sterile for generations. Populations can be scattered. Civilizations can collapse. Knowledge can be lost. But memory, if carefully preserved, can outlast the destruction. The clay tablets survived because they were valued enough to preserve, copy, transmit across centuries. The laments were maintained because each generation deemed it essential that the next understand what happened when the weapons came from heaven. But the tablets hint at something that makes scholars deeply uncomfortable. Something about who made these weapons, where they came from, why they existed at all, and whether the Anunnaki mythology represents something more than allegory. In the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, before the upheavals of recent decades, there was a tablet from Eridu that rarely appeared in public exhibitions. Its content made curators uncomfortable. The text describes knowledge that the Anunnaki deliberately withheld from humanity, not out of spite, but from concern about consequences. The tablet catalogues what the gods taught and what they refused to teach. Agriculture, yes. Metallurgy, yes. Writing, astronomy, mathematics, medicine, all transmitted to humanity through deliberate instruction. But certain knowledge remained restricted. The text uses a specific phrase, Nam Gishkim, which translates roughly as forbidden understanding, or knowledge that brings destruction. Among the forbidden subjects, weapons that harness forces of nature in ways that render land uninhabitable. The text doesn't present this as arbitrary divine gatekeeping. It frames the restriction as protective, born from experience. That which we learned brought ash. That which we created brought silence. That which we used brought regret that echoes across generations. The implication is that the Anunnaki themselves had crossed these boundaries before, that they knew firsthand the consequences of deploying such weapons, that the decision to use them against the Sumerian cities wasn't made in ignorance, but in full awareness of the devastation that would follow. Picture yourself in a research library late at night. The building is quiet, the fluorescent lights humming softly. Before you lies a comparative mythology text examining destruction narratives across cultures. The pattern repeats with unsettling consistency. In the Mahabharata, the ancient Sanskrit epic, there's a description of the Brahmastra, a weapon so devastating that its use is forbidden except in the most extreme circumstances. The text describes its effects: blinding light, consuming heat, winds that tear flesh from bone, contamination that lingers for generations. Warriors who witness its deployment are horrified. The gods themselves declare it should never have been created. The similarities to the Mesopotamian laments aren't superficial. The sequence of effects matches. The emphasis on forbidden nature matches. The divine regret matches. In the biblical account of Sodom and Gomorrah, destruction comes from heaven in the form of brimstone and fire. The cities are annihilated utterly. The land becomes sterile. Lot's wife, looking back at the destruction, is killed by exposure to whatever descended from the sky. The location, the Jordan Valley, the same region as Tal el-Hammam, adds geographic correspondence to the narrative parallel. In Greek mythology, the Titans wage war using weapons that shake the foundations of the earth, that generate heat capable of melting stone, that threaten to render the world uninhabitable. Zeus, victorious, locks these weapons away in Tartarus, declaring them too dangerous for continued existence. The global distribution of these narratives has typically been explained through independent development. Humans across cultures, creating similar mythologies to explain natural disasters. Thunder becomes divine weapons. Volcanoes become godly wrath. Earthquakes become cosmic battles. But the specificity troubles this interpretation. The descriptions align too precisely. The effects sequence matches too closely. The moral framework, that these weapons represent forbidden knowledge, that their use violates fundamental principles, appears too consistently. In the Oriental Institute archives at the University of Chicago, a researcher has compiled cross-cultural references to weapons of the gods across ancient literature. The compilation spans Mesopotamian, Indian, Hebrew, Greek, Norse, and Chinese sources. Despite geographic and temporal separation, the descriptions cluster around similar phenomena: extreme light, devastating wind, lingering contamination, divine prohibition. Either ancient cultures independently imagined the same hypothetical superweapons with remarkable consistency, or they were describing something real, something witnessed, something preserved in cultural memory through mythology, because no other framework existed to contain such knowledge. The Mesopotamian texts add a unique element to this pattern: administrative detail. Other mythologies describe divine weapons in broad strokes. The Sumerian laments provide specifics, catalog numbers, temporal markers, effect sequences, contamination timelines. The bureaucratic precision suggests these weren't purely mythological compositions, but contained historical kernel preserved through theological framing. In Paris, at the Louvre, a less examined tablet contains a dialogue between Enki and a human king. The king asks why certain knowledge is withheld. Enki's response is preserved. What you seek would give you power over cities, over armies, over the very earth itself. But such power corrupts understanding. The weapon becomes the purpose. The capability becomes the imperative. Soon you would use it not because you must, but because you can. And then you would stand where we have stood, among the ashes, asking why we permitted such knowledge to exist at all. This isn't typical God-human interaction in mythology. Gods don't usually explain their reasoning. They command, and humans obey or face consequences. But this text presents rational argument, acknowledgement of temptation, warning based on experience. The forbidden knowledge theme weaves through Mesopotamian literature with consistent emphasis. The Epic of Gilgamesh includes passages where the hero seeks immortality, but is warned that some knowledge brings only sorrow. The Enuma Elish describes weapons created during the divine conflicts that are subsequently hidden away. The Atrahasis epic mentions technologies that were deliberately not transmitted to humanity. scholars argue this represents universal mythological pattern, forbidden fruit, Pandora's box, knowledge that brings downfall. Every culture develops narratives about limits that shouldn't be crossed, boundaries that separate safe from dangerous, understanding. But the Mesopotamian versions include technical details that other mythologies lack. They specify what the knowledge does, how it functions, what consequences follow its application. They describe not abstract corruption, but concrete effects: cities destroyed, lands sterilized, populations scattered, civilizations collapsed. In Albuquerque, at Sandia National Laboratories, researchers studying nuclear weapons history have noted the parallels. J. Robert Oppenheimer, watching the Trinity test, famously quoted the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." He recognized in ancient Sanskrit the same moral weight, the same recognition of boundary crossed, that modern physicists felt witnessing nuclear weapons. The forbidden knowledge isn't hypothetical. It exists. Humanity developed it in the 20th century. The question is whether humanity developed it for the first time, or whether we rediscovered capabilities that ancient civilizations, or the beings they called Anunnaki, possessed and used and came to regret. The tablets preserve both the knowledge that such weapons existed and the warning that their use brings consequences that echo across generations. Whether this represents mythological wisdom, cultural memory of actual events, or prophetic warning about humanity's future, the message remains consistent. Some capabilities, once demonstrated, cannot be forgotten. Some boundaries, once crossed, cannot be restored. The evidence points back to the same question that opened this journey through clay and dust and ancient memory. Which brings us back to the wind that destroyed Sumer, back to the beginning, armed now with context, with evidence, with uncomfortable possibilities that resist easy conclusions. The evidence sprawls before us like fragments from a shattered vessel, clay tablets describing weapons from heaven, archaeological sites showing temperatures beyond Bronze Age capability, consistent patterns across cultures separated by geography and time, physical evidence matching ancient descriptions, divine regret preserved in religious texts, contamination timelines that align with radioactive decay. How do we assemble these fragments into coherent understanding? Picture yourself in a conference room where archaeologists, linguists, materials scientists, and historians have gathered to examine the Tal el-Hammam findings. The published studies lie on the table. The debate is careful, measured, cautious. Each discipline approaches the evidence from different angles, seeking explanations that fit within established frameworks. 4 primary theories have emerged, each with strengths, each with gaps. The meteor airburst hypothesis offers the most scientifically conservative explanation. An object entering Earth's atmosphere, perhaps 50 meters in diameter, explodes at altitude over the Jordan Valley around 1650 BCE. The airburst releases energy equivalent to multiple megatons of TNT. The heat vitrifies materials on the ground. The pressure wave destroys structures. The event is witnessed across the region. Ancient peoples, lacking framework to comprehend cosmic impacts, interpret the catastrophe through theological lens. The Anunnaki didn't deploy weapons. The scribes attributed a natural disaster to divine action because that was their only available explanatory model. The consistency across texts reflects shared cultural interpretation of genuinely catastrophic event. The strengths are substantial. Meteor airbursts are known phenomena. Tunguska provides documented comparison. The physical evidence, shocked quartz, vitrified materials directional heating, matches airburst signatures. No supernatural explanations required. The weaknesses are equally significant. Why do the texts describe multiple coordinated strikes rather than single impact? Why the emphasis on divine decision-making, debate, regret? Why describe weapons as forbidden if they're natural phenomena? Ancient Mesopotamians had extensive astronomical knowledge, documented meteor observations. When they wanted to describe celestial events, they did so explicitly. The Lament texts use different vocabulary, different frameworks. This interpretation takes the tablets more literally. The Anunnaki were historical beings, not supernatural entities, but representatives of an advanced civilization, possibly predating known history. They possessed technology far beyond Bronze Age capability. Internal conflicts led to deployment of devastating weapons against Mesopotamian cities. Survivors interpreted these technological beings through divine frameworks because they had no other context. The evidence supporting this includes the administrative detail in texts, the technical precision of descriptions, the emphasis on physical tools rather than miraculous powers. The Anunnaki are described arriving from elsewhere, establishing territorial control, using vehicles and weapons, engaging in politics, behavior more consistent with advanced civilization than transcendent deities. The weaknesses center on evidence absence. Where are the remains of this civilization? Where is their material culture, their infrastructure, their technology? Archaeological record shows continuous development from Neolithic through Bronze Age, without gaps suggesting intervention by more advanced society. The theory requires acceptance of lost civilization, for which direct evidence doesn't exist. A subset of Theory 2 proposes the Anunnaki were literally those who came from the heavens, extraterrestrial visitors, possessing technology that appeared divine to Bronze Age observers. The weapons described were advanced munitions. The airborne vehicles were spacecraft. The contamination was radiation from nuclear or plasma weapons. This explains the technological descriptions, the arrival from elsewhere, the capabilities beyond human understanding. It accounts for why knowledge was withheld. More advanced species, limiting technology transfer to developing civilization. It explains the consistency of similar accounts globally, multiple contact events interpreted through local mythological frameworks. The weaknesses mirror Theory 2 but intensify. No physical evidence of extraterrestrial presence exists. The theory requires acceptance of visitation without material confirmation. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and the available evidence, while intriguing, doesn't conclusively demonstrate non-human origin. Perhaps the answer lies not in single cause but convergence, a natural catastrophe, meteor airburst or series of airbursts, devastates the region around 1650 BCE. The event coincides with existing warfare or political instability. Survivors, traumatized, process the catastrophe through their theological framework, attributing it to divine weapons deployed by the Anunnaki. The physical evidence is genuine, but naturally caused. The textual evidence reflects real events filtered through cultural interpretation. The consistency across texts reflects genuine shared experience of catastrophic natural disaster. The forbidden knowledge theme represents wisdom about warfare and human destructiveness generally, not specific lost technology. This synthesis accommodates both skeptical and evidence-based perspectives. It doesn't require lost civilizations or extraterrestrial contact, while acknowledging something extraordinary occurred that ancient peoples struggled to comprehend and felt compelled to preserve for future generations. In the museums where these tablets rest, scholars continue debating. The evidence resists definitive interpretation. Each theory illuminates certain aspects while leaving others in shadow. What can be stated with confidence, without speculation, based solely on verifiable evidence? Something catastrophic happened in the ancient Near East around 1650 BCE. Multiple urban centers experienced sudden, devastating destruction. The physical evidence indicates temperatures and forces far beyond Bronze Age technological capability. The destruction coincided with civilizational collapse across a wide region. Ancient scribes preserved detailed accounts of this catastrophe with unusual care and precision. They described the events using theological frameworks, but included technical details, sequences, timelines, effects, consequences. They emphasized that knowledge related to these weapons was forbidden, that their use violated fundamental principles, that even divine authorities regretted the decision. The texts were maintained across centuries, copied repeatedly, incorporated into educational curriculum. Civilizations that followed deemed preservation of this memory essential. Modern analysis confirms aspects of the ancient descriptions. The temperatures existed, the contamination occurred, the timelines match, the effects align. Whether the Anunnaki were gods, advanced humans, extraterrestrial, visitors, or mythological constructs created to explain natural catastrophe remains open question. The evidence supports multiple interpretations. What doesn't remain open is that something happened. Something was witnessed. Something was deemed important enough to preserve in clay that would outlast stone, outlast empire, outlast the civilizations that recorded it. The tablets speak across 4 millennia. We listen with tools the scribes couldn't have imagined: spectrometry, radiocarbon dating, materials analysis, comparative linguistics. Yet even with these advantages, certainty eludes us. Perhaps certainty isn't the point. Perhaps the value lies in the questions themselves, in the willingness to examine evidence that challenges comfortable narratives, in the preservation of memory, even when memory contains things we don't fully understand. In archive rooms across the world, the clay waits. The wedge marks preserve their message. The dust of ancient cities holds its secrets. The questions multiply rather than resolve, each answer opening new uncertainties, each certainty revealing deeper mysteries. But mysteries can be held gently. Questions can be companions rather than torments. And sleep can come even, especially, when not everything is resolved, when wonder remains, when the night holds both evidence and enigma in patient balance. Return with me to the University of Pennsylvania Museum. The hour is late. The galleries are closed to the public. Security lights cast long shadows across the Babylonian section. In its climate-controlled drawer, catalog number CBS 2204 rests, as it has for over a century since its excavation from Nippur's temple library. The clay is cool to the touch, unchanged, patient, 4,000 years separate the scribe who pressed these marks from the fingers that now examine them. 4,000 years of empires rising and falling, of languages born and extinct, of technologies imagined and created, and sometimes regretted. Yet the message endures, carried in clay that outlasted bronze, that outlasted iron, that outlasts the digital age with its fragile dependencies. What the tablets teach us extends beyond the specific question of what destroyed Sumer. They teach us that civilizations can end not gradually, but in moments, that the boundary between thriving and ash can be measured in heartbeats rather than generations, that what seems permanent, great cities, established orders, accumulated knowledge, can vanish so completely that later peoples debate whether the accounts of their existence are metaphor or history. They teach us that memory is worth preserving, even when, especially when, memory contains uncomfortable truths. The Sumerian scribes who copied these laments generation after generation understood something essential: that forgetting is easier than remembering, that convenience erases better than catastrophe, that the stories we least want to maintain are often the ones most critical to transmit. Picture yourself standing in the Jordan Valley as night settles. The excavation at Tal el-Hammam sleeps beneath protective tarps. The destruction layer waits in the earth, patient as the tablets, bearing witness to temperatures and forces that shouldn't exist in Bronze Age contexts. Above, stars emerge in patterns the Sumerians charted, named, wove into their cosmology. Somewhere in this darkness, witnesses stood 4,000 years ago and watched the sky tear open, watched brilliance descend, felt heat that melted stone, survived wind that demolished cities, and later, those who lived, who carried the memory, who found scribes willing to commit testimony to clay, they ensured the story wouldn't vanish with them. The restoration of these fragments, both textual and archaeological, creates a kind of conversation across time. The ancient scribes speak. Modern researchers listen, question, analyze, debate. The evidence accumulates. The mysteries deepen rather than resolve. And perhaps that's appropriate. Perhaps some questions serve us better by remaining open than by closing prematurely around insufficient answers. What we preserve, we remember. The tablets exist because each generation chose preservation over disposal, deemed these texts worth the effort of copying, worth the precious clay and scribal labor, worth the archive space. That choice compounds across centuries until we inherit not just fragments but intent, the clear message that this matters, that we were meant to know, that the future should understand what happened when certain boundaries were crossed. What we bury, we might excavate. The destruction layer at Tal el-Hammam slept for millennia, growing corn and wheat in modern fields, hiding its secrets beneath accumulated dust and time, until excavation revealed the anomalous heat signatures, the vitrified pottery, the evidence that refused comfortable explanation. The earth keeps records, too, written in minerals and isotopes, in shocked quartz, and melted brick. What we question, we honor. To examine these tablets with skepticism isn't to dismiss them, but to take them seriously enough to demand rigorous understanding. The scribes who preserved these accounts would likely approve of careful analysis, of debate about interpretation, of refusal to accept easy answers. They worked in an intellectual tradition that valued precision, that developed sophisticated literary forms, that understood the difference between allegory and documentation. In the museums where these fragments rest, Philadelphia, London, Paris, Berlin, New Haven, Chicago, the archives maintain their vigil. Climate control systems hum. Digital catalogs track each item's location. Researchers submit requests for access. Translations are revised as understanding of ancient Sumerian evolves. The conversation continues. The clay remembers what stone forgets, what metal corrodes away, what organic materials dissolve into earth. The wedge marks, pressed 4,000 years ago, remain crisp, readable, unchanged by time that weathered away the cities they describe. There's something profound in this, that testimony outlasts the events it testifies to, that warning survives the catastrophe it warns against. Perhaps the Anunnaki were gods. Perhaps they were myths created to explain natural disaster. Perhaps they were historical beings with advanced technology. Perhaps they were something we don't yet have frameworks to comprehend. The tablets don't provide definitive answer, and the archaeological evidence, while extraordinary, permits multiple interpretations. But what the tablets do provide is this: recognition that knowledge can be dangerous, that capability doesn't equal wisdom, that some technologies, once developed, pose questions about whether they should exist at all. This understanding didn't originate in the 20th century with nuclear weapons. It echoes through ancient literature, Mesopotamian, Indian, Hebrew, Greek, suggesting humanity has grappled with these questions across millennia. The evil wind that destroyed Sumer, whether divine weapon or cosmic impact or something between, left more than ruins. It left warning, it left memory, it left evidence that each generation must examine anew, using whatever tools and understanding we possess, adding our interpretations to the long chain of human effort to comprehend catastrophe and perhaps, someday, to prevent its repetition. Your breath has slowed as we've traveled through these archives and excavations. The questions that seemed urgent at the beginning soften now into something gentler, wonder rather than anxiety, curiosity rather than demand for certainty. This is how the mystery holds us, not by resolving, but by inviting, not by answering, but by deepening. Rest now, fellow seeker. The tablets will be there tomorrow, patient in their drawers. The excavations will continue revealing their secrets slowly, one careful brush stroke at a time. The questions will wait, growing richer rather than stale, accumulating context rather than dust. Somewhere in Mesopotamia, in the place that is once Sumer, the wind still moves across desert valleys. It carries dust from ruins that predated Rome, that predated Athens, that watched the first experiments in writing and law and urban civilization. The dust settles, the night deepens, the stars wheel overhead in patterns the Anunnaki supposedly named, and in climate-controlled archives across the world, the clay endures. The wedge marks speak, the evidence waits, the memory, carefully preserved across 4,000 years of human history, continues its patient vigil, warning and witness both, question and answer intertwined, sleeping and waking together in the vast darkness where all our certainties dissolve and only wonder remains. Sleep well, traveler. The mysteries keep their watch. The dust remembers. The clay endures. And in the morning, should you choose, the questions will be waiting, not as burdens, but as invitations, not as problems requiring solution, but as doorways opening into deeper understanding of who we are, what we've survived, and what ancient voices, pressed into clay, still have to teach us about power and wisdom and the terrible, beautiful responsibility of knowledge. Rest, dream. Let the ancient wind carry you gently into sleep.